Lincoln, who's the most clutch player on this guy?
Not Marina Mabrey.
Becky Hammon is one of the best guards in WNBA history, but went undrafted in 1999. On today's show, we'll kick off Season 2 of our Retrospect scouting series with a historical scout on Hammon coming out of Colorado State. Locked On Women's Basketball starts now.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. You are Locked On Women's Basketball. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. My name is Hunter Cruse. I'm your Saturday host covering the WNBA draft and prospect scouting. I'm joined by my co-host M. Adler, Lincoln Shafer. M covers the WNBA with a focus on player development in the game within the game. Lincoln also contributes to our WNBA draft coverage at the Next. So, to start this off, M, for someone that's never watched one of our Retrospect scouting series, how is this one different? What's the approach to this? And why are we going back and watching old film on players that have already been retired well by now? You're on mute.
No, I'm not. So for someone who hasn't read our podcast before, this is what we do when we go back and look at, the best prospects of all time, or in the case of this season, some of the best prospects of all time versus some of the most very good prospects who
Overlooked.
For some reason, yes, if you will, very good players who for some reason, were not picked where in retrospect you would expect them to. So in that sense, got in that buzz keyword retrospect in there. But in this case, shit. Hold on, I wasn't prepared to answer that question.
The thing, how I would explain it is, with this season, it's different just from the approach that some of these players were just misevaluations by the league. Other players just got a lot better after they were drafted. But in the case of Becky Hammon, I view it as like a misevaluation by the league because all of it was there. It was very clear, not just by the stats, but the film, that this is a player that should have been taken in the first round. But
absolutely,
I understand that there was the older players that were coming in, but at the same time, this was a player that was an All-American that averaged 20 points. I'll go through the stat profile before we get into the scout itself. In 125 career games, she averaged 22 points, 4 assists, and 4 rebounds on 55% shooting from 2. She's 5'6". That's very good. And she also shot 41% from 3 on 7 attempts per game from 3. She led the nation in
5 steals a game or something.
Yeah, she led the nation in 3-point attempts.
If
and then
you
3-pointers
take
made
into
as well.
account her position, she's the most efficient high-scoring guard in NCAA history, as far back as the stats on Sports Reference go, since 1987-88, I believe. Mm-hmm. She is the only player at her position to average 21-plus points per game on over 61% true shooting, which takes into account three-point shooting and free throw shooting. Just an incredibly efficient scorer at her size, at any size.
She took 274 threes in her senior season. Do you know where that would have ranked last year in threes attempted?
Second?
Third, only behind Fair and Caitlin Clark. That's a lot of threes in 1999 to be taking that volume, shooting 41% from 3. She also got to the free throw line a lot as well. So all of it was there.
Yeah, she drew Sorry.
Yeah, the free throw rate was pretty high as well. The 3-point rate was like over 50%, which is unheard of for the time.
Yeah, the sort of thing when you're looking at her statistical profile where you get a lot of indicators if you're looking at it where you're like, this was, some 5'11", ball dominant wing in the mid-major who was making a bunch of All-American teams. And some of that is correct. She wasn't 5'11". Sure as hell played like it. And I think the question you kind of have to answer when you look at the statistical profile is how does someone who puts up these numbers and who appears to be able to do this go undrafted? I think, famously, she is one of only like 2 interesting players in league history who've ever gone undrafted, and the other one got benched for Caitlin Clark. In addition, we tend to spend too much time looking at, I think, just general draft history. And so this whole series is born out of us being extreme dorks and wanting to ask, hey, how did this happen? How does Tip Hayes go in the second round? How does Dewana Bonner go like 5th instead of 2nd? All this kind of stuff.
This is all happening because 4 of my top 10 most visited sites are different WNBA drafts on Basketball Reference.
We will be getting to those later in the series, so look out for your favorite second-round draft pick. They might come up in this series.
Yeah, so the biggest thing for Becky and why she was not drafted is, I went through a lot of different articles from the time. A lot of the things they were saying was it was the size, playing at a mid-major, and the third thing was her speed, her athleticism. For you, Em, whenever you watched her film, is the speed an issue? Like, what would you say about that? Like, that was just a major issue with her game from the scouts back then.
Yes, notably Becky Hammon, a player who at no point in her career looked, at all faster than anyone who was guarding her. Very slow player trotting up and down. No, it is impossible to watch Becky Hammon for more than 2 plays and to see her as anything other than the most athletic player on the court. Leaving aside the issue of size, because we'll get to that specific concern in a minute. Her burst, her lateral quickness, I shouldn't say her lateral quickness. Her lateral quickness was great. Her ability to move her hips, shuffle, everything on offense. But specifically her burst was clearly excellent. Her burst was probably better than any guard the WNBA had seen, who was entering their athletic prime at this point in time. Cheryl Swoops is already in her prime a little bit later. Cynthia Cooper is in her late 30s. We don't have to, there's not a lot of great guard play, which is also a thing to keep in mind when we talk about, the value of certain roles when it comes to her. I'm sure Jackie Stiles will be brought up as we talk about this in later episodes, that we're not doing one specifically on her. And so someone who, today would be if we sort of just translate them forward as a multi-time all-star, back then as a guard, you're literally MVP caliber because of positional things. So in terms of, again, the athleticism at her size, it is impossible to watch her as a sane human being with decent vision and to think that this person struggles with quickness. There are aspects of her athletic game that we can talk about that are harder to see, in which she is one of the best of all time, but specifically on speed, it's there.
Yeah, and even if she didn't have the speed necessarily, she does have good burst. Even without the burst, her handle is absolutely absurd. She's kind of just toying with defenders through the games that we watched. She's setting up defenders with crossovers, hezzies. She takes an in and out hezzy step back 3 in 1999. Who else is doing that? It's really, really absurd, the kind of things that she's doing on the court. She's throwing backwards passes over her head to players that no one can see from where she is. The ball is just on a string. She's just doing things that nobody was doing in 1999 and scoring incredibly efficiently. Her playmaking is significantly better than the numbers would suggest. She only averaged about 3.8 assists for her whole college career, but her passing is just on an extremely high level. She shoots maybe better than almost any college player ever. And is just a truly absurd offensive engine. But the thing that surprised me in her tape was the defensive playmaking, which is really solid. It's a little bit gambly, but she is just an event creator on that end. There's the transition block she had against Southwest Missouri State. She has some steals. She'll just double off of non-shooters and go create havoc in the weird matchup zone that they're playing and just create things out of nothing.
Yeah, there are, specifically on the defensive end, there are there are, again, different standards for what we consider a good guard defender back then. We talked about this on the Kelsey Plum episode, but did we do a whole episode for Kelsey Plum? Not the point. I talked about this on Kelsey Plum episode. There were a lot of projectables with her when it came to defense, and that is settling in, I think, the past couple of years, and she's become a very solid defender at the WNBA level at this point. She's not, I think, remotely a big liability on that end, and she can provide some quality stoppage, but she's not, she's not Jackie Young. She'll never be confused for that. But being a competent guard defender these days, back then is, makes you one of the, like the best guard defender in the league, which, is not to say anything about the quality of the game of the players back then. A lot of them were just excellent players you could drop into any period and would excel. But it is to say that you could play like Becky did defensively and get away with it. Becky had huge issues when it came to, defending straight up, with her hips aligned straight to her defender's line when they were both squared up. There were huge issues when it came to that. And, she just could not really turn her hips specifically defensively in a way that could account for that. I can't really say whether that was specifically a physical limitation versus just not having the coordination or the energy on that end. That's the sort of double down WNBA, rest in peace, scale of can't, won't, or doesn't know how. It's either won't or doesn't know how. But in that sense, again, relative to other guards at that age, she's not, the worst guard defender on your team. She's probably not the worst one in your starting lineup, at least at that point in time. And with what you're saying about the handle, look, it's one of the best handles of all time, just looking at what she was able to do there. You have enough sample size against, what is today Missouri State and Southwest Missouri State back then. You have the samples against, the better teams when they get farther in the tournament. You have actual Power 5 competition, but you can look at who they're playing in their conference. Like you said with the assists, you have to keep in mind, when someone is playing at a level below their talent, their scoring is going to go up relative to, your quote unquote true talent if you're at the same level as someone who's playing at USC. But the assists go way down because your teammates aren't making as good at the shots. So you have to, balance those things accordingly. To that end, Becky, Hunter, you mentioned the stats. Becky, across her two upperclassmen years, she put up 23, 4, 4.5, and 3 on a triple slash of 50, 41, and 87. No player has ever hit that. In a single season. The players to have
really
a single
absurd shooter.
Yeah. The players to even come close to that. So again, the players to average instead of 23, 4, and 4.5, 23 and 3, and instead of 50, 41, 87, just 45, 35, 80. Caitlin Clark did it 3 times. Paige has done it twice. Maya, KP, Kelsey Mitchell, Rachel Banham, KLS, Bridget Carlton, Eva Hodgson, shout out William and Mary and UNC, Michaela Kelly, Molly Davis, and a few mid-major and a few pure mid-major players you probably haven't heard of. Again, that list is about a 90% hit rate of being a good WNBA player, about a 50% hit rate of being an all WNBA caliber player or better. That's Becky. That's just Becky Hammon on paper, to say nothing of what we see in the scout.
Well, and according to her induction into the South Dakota Basketball Hall of Fame, where she played in high school, she shot 60% from the field, 50% from 3, and over 80% from the free throw line in high school, while scoring 26 points per game in a place where your team is scoring 30 to 45 points per game in 1993 in South Dakota. So it's truly an absurdly efficient offensive profile.
This is all to say that if you knew nothing about her and you were just looking at on paper, you're looking at a player who, the modern day equivalent is if you saw McKenna Hofschild, but a far better 3-point shooter and 4 inches taller, with way more team success.
It's a good player. So after the break, we'll get into our scouting grades on Hammon. We'll also talk about her WNBA career later on. With PrizePicks, you could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports teams this summer. If we're looking for promotions, PrizePicks has you covered every week, from lowering select player stat projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chances of winning, to getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Fridays. The finals means more with PrizePicks, but so do the stars too. You get boosted payouts on select basketball stars that you won't find anywhere else. When the finals are over, hoops action doesn't stop on PrizePicks. From Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese to Asia Wilson and Brianna Stewart, you can win up to 100 times your cash watching them ball out. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. If you didn't know already, Locked On Women's Basketball brings you can't-miss analysis, news, and opinions, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So to open segment 2, I want to talk a little bit more about just this draft in general. So if you weren't aware, the league had they moved the ABL into the league. Is that how it happened? Like the ABL folded heading into this year.
Yeah.
So we exist in the darkest timeline where the ABL folded and the WNBA won. There's a better timeline out there where the opposite. Yeah, there's a better timeline out there where the opposite happened, but unfortunately we live in this one. And so the ABL folded, and as a way of sort of ensuring that all the good players didn't immediately go to the more attractive, appealing WNBA markets and teams.
You can say the Comets.
The Comets, the Liberty. Maybe the Sparks, but most of the Comets and the Liberty. They
still went to the Liberty though.
Yeah. in this case, yes. They had
two.
Yes, So they took the 2 players and they assigned them to
the newest expansion teams,
yes,
the Lynx and the Miracle.
Yes, it's essentially mirroring what they had done with the rest of the WNBA in the prior years, where they had auto-allocated this way. They had immediate star power entering these 2 markets. You had Keisha Sales going to Orlando, and you had Katie Smith going to Minnesota. Lincoln, I got something wrong.
Shannon Johnson is the ABL representative for the Orlando Miracle. There's a pre-expansion draft allocation of talent and a post-expansion draft allocation of ABL talent, which are separate things. I don't know why they're separate, but that's just how it happened after the ABL goes bankrupt. So Katie Smith is the Minnesota Lynx pick to join her Columbus Quest head coach Brian Adler in Minnesota, who also picked up 4 other ABL players in the draft because for some reason they decided that the best way to fold the ABL into the WNBA was to include every ABL player except for those 2 in the college draft. I don't know why they thought that was a good idea.
Yeah. And the funny thing I noticed from this draft was, so most teams back in the early years used to have a general manager and executive and the coach. The coach would just do all of the roles. They would just do it all. But New York ran more like a modern approach. They had their general manager, they also had their head coach. The head coach was not the primary decision maker. He wanted Becky Hammon, but the scouts were like, "Nah, she's too slow. Well, we don't want her. Well, if she's undrafted, fine, you can pick her up. It doesn't matter." So that's what ended up happening. She makes the roster, becomes a very good player, the face of their franchise, gets traded eventually. We'll talk about her career in segment 3, but before we get there, what is your grade on Becky? Like a historical grade from back in the day.
Lincoln, would you do the honors?
I think I'm at a 60 plus. It's like, to me, from her college tape, I'm a little concerned about the size. The shooting is absurd. The offensive engine stuff is absurd. I worry a little bit about how that translates to athletes, but like a fringe all W kind of talent is what I see on the tape.
For me, it's really tricky. And one of the things we try to do, we talked about this a bunch last summer, is make these grades independent of knowing what happens in their career, even though to some extent you do. This is easier with some than others. So like with Simone Augustus, there are fair questions about the scalability of her role, how much that overlap with teammates in Minnesota. Was the defense actually that bad? Was it actually kind of good during the dynasty run? There's a lot of gray area there, and just using her as an example, you can be somewhere between like a 7+ and like a 55 in terms of her grade, and we can have that gray area when it came to make a catchings. It's either an 8 or we're doing something wrong. You can sort of be in that range there, and I think with Becky, I try to do that as well. For me, I'm sort of with you. I have the concerns about the size. I think knowing what we know now and applying it back then, I think I probably overrate how important a decel is, because we know how important it is to finishing these days. But when it came to, I was talking about the finer points of the athleticism before, her rotational flexibility is one of the best I've ever seen. Her ability to really get skinny and fight through spaces and finish through contact is one of the best ever. That's why she's able to do so much in spite of her height. You can look at her, you could track her rim rates. The W actually has data going back that far, and her rim finishing, it's frankly insane for someone of her height. And because of, again, defense is a lot easier to get away with on the guard end of those things, I think for me, it's somewhere between a 55 and a 60, which is to say, at minimum, worst player on a title team, probably like perennial all-star. And I'll say, I wish I had a little more film here, because that's the wrong grade. We'll talk about her W career and what happened there, but like that is objectively, like, she was way better than that.
Yeah, see, my concern and why I also am like on that higher end. I have a 6 on her, so kind of split the difference between you guys. My thing is, she has the skill set, and she's the player that is so dependent on fit. Like, she mentioned it after she was drafted, where if she didn't go to New York, there was a chance she would have never got the opportunity, like, to get a took to turn that roster spot into more playing time after Teaspoon left. So if I knew, like for example, if I was that New York general manager and I knew I had like some power to roster her, take the development slowly, this is a player that I would probably have like a 65 or a 70 on. But knowing what we knew back then, small guard, there's all these older players coming into the league. Where's the opportunity going to be? So I would probably just lean like lower end, because there was not many opportunities for these young players to come in. A lot of them flamed out, but like in Becky's case, had a 15-plus year career.
Do you have any comps?
There's definitely some of what I see with Georgia Amore now, a little bit. Just in terms of like the pull-up shooting, the driving, being able to split tight spaces. I would say Becky's a better prospect, just considering the time period. What she did was just way more unique. I would also say the defense was probably a little bit better, and the finishing is better too as well. But I think Georgia Amore, you'll see a little bit of comparisons there.
Pace, creativity, size, defensive playmaking. There's a little bit you can say there comparing to Chris Paul.
Huh. Oh yeah, I remember you mentioned that before. For me, the thing that came to mind watching her over and over again was very much Kelsey Plum.
That's in terms of
and especially in terms of the absolute dominant athleticism, the flashes defensively, the shot making, and the kind of 3-level scoring, but mostly 2-level scoring, but like the good way, like rim 3, and she can work in between if need be.
That was one thing I did notice. Like the shot profile was so modern.
It's so funny. Like
her teammates would take like foot on the line 2s, and then she would be like, "Yeah, I'm gonna get my foot right behind this 3-point line, bomb it, make it." Like, which
like makes total sense when you look at the Aces these days. It's like, that team is obviously coached by the player that we're watching at Colorado State. But yeah, I mean, in terms of that, and also in terms of the question of like, is this a point guard? Is this a sort of like high on ball 2 guard? I think also translated a lot to what I was seeing from Kelsey.
That's what they had her playing that role early in New York, and then she kind of translated to being this full-time point guard. But in segment 3, we'll get into that more. We'll talk about her WNBA career and more. LinkedIn just isn't another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy, and when you make that many quality candidates, so easy in fact that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a new feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, for segment 3, where does Becky Hammon rank among the best point guards ever for you?
I can hear an argument for anywhere between 1 and 4. To me, anything lower than 4 is wrong. I have her number 1. I have her number 1 with a bullet.
Who's she ahead of?
So I mean, everyone. If she's number 1, we'll see what happens.
Players.
Sloot, Chelsea Gray.
Sloot, Chelsea Gray, Sue, and Whalen, I think, are the players that you sort of put in this all-time point guard tier. I think you can't really talk about Lindsay Whalen in the same tier as them. Even as dominant as her peak was, sort of it looks the same when it comes to impact on team winning across their like true prime. But Lindsay Whalen's was so short, but the high quality veteran period was really long after that, and in a great way too. But I think it's very hard to sort of make the case that the peak there was for Whalen was both as good and as long as everyone else in that group, unless you're talking about sort of the impact on team winning, in which case I don't think you can talk about. I don't think you can.
Becky did have the opportunity though.
Yes, exactly. She went to multiple finals. She was with the Liberty in multiple finals, and then she dragged San Antonio to an incredibly unlikely finals finish in a year where they were starting like 3 centers, one of whom was Ann Waters. She took Ann Waters to the finals. It's crazy. That being said, for me, she's number 1 with the bullet. She's the lone singular offensive engine in league history. It's like the only.
She nearly won MVP, which is like never
Twice.
happens for a point guard. Yeah,
Yes.
She finished second MVP.
Second
once
place in
on the
MVP
league.
voting in 2007. Yeah. Her first year with San Antonio, she finishes second in MVP voting.
Yes, her first year in San Antonio, she finished second in MVP voting. Lincoln to whom?
2007. That's the year of. I can't remember.
That's Lauren Jackson.
Is it Lauren Jackson? Yeah, it's LJ.
Yeah, who I think we would all rank as like a top 3 player of all time.
Top 3 talent, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of peak, yeah. So when you're talking about Becky Hammon, this is someone who, participated in those sort of things with New York. She was multiple times she nearly got most improved player, despite the sort of system. Richie Adubato, excellent coach for the time, but there's only so much you can do in the 2000s when you're basically like a Kelsey Plum type of player. And Hunter, you were talking about that usage early on in New York. She then gets the role, but when you're playing next to Vicki Johnson, Teaspoon for the first couple of years, Vicki Johnson, as it went on, you're not going to be playing really hard like pure point guard that much. You're not going to have the ball in your hands as much, and so she's able to not only fill these multiple roles on these caliber of teams, but again, the minute that she is in playing with Dan Hughes, just from the second she's playing with him, she's immediately first team all WNBA, finishes second in MVP voting. They go to the finals 2 years later, and again, I think the thing that I really want to drive home with her is how versatile she was. She has one of the highest usage rates in league history because Dan Hughes basically built the boat around her every year, but it's also how much the team was able to adapt around her and her to adapt to the team. She could play next to Vicki Johnson both in New York and in San Antonio, funny enough, when that second thing came around, and she was able to be one of the best off-ball players of all time in addition to what she could do on the ball. For as high as that usage was, and you can look at the turnovers, and they're huge in San Antonio, she still has like a 3-2 or like a 1.5 to 1 assist to turnover ratio. When you look at the level of usage she's at, that is insane that she was able to be such a dominant creator of offense, both for herself and teammates. You could play her next to way too small of a lineup. You could play her next to Shamika Holtzclaw, Sophia Young-Malcolm, Erin Perperoglu, and Edwidge Lawson-Wade, and she could still just drive that offense. Or you could start her in a lineup that had Ann Waters at the 5 and Sophia Young-Malcolm at the 3, and she will take that lineup and make the offense so damn good they still go to the finals. There is no one, I think, in league history who has been able to stack up to that. And I think, again, you could argue as time went on, the defensive limitations became more important. But no one has been able to drive that much on offense and not be even remotely good on defense, let alone for that era when the replacement level for defensive guards was still low enough that it didn't matter nearly as much. And she really did, I think, make an impact as a help defender despite her size, far beyond, I think, what you see even out of Sue Bird at sort of the same age until you get into their 30s.
Yeah, in that 2007 season, she's 5th in the league in points per game and 1st in the league in assists per game. 3 of the top 10 in points per game are that Phoenix team that's basically playing a different sport. Uh, Everybody else is grinded down mud, and then you have Diana Taurasi throwing lobs to Cappy Pondexter from 95 feet. And they're just playing a different sport. But it's just absurd what kind of usage and what kind of scoring she's putting up. Her, like, you can argue that her peak comes from age 30 to 35 with San Antonio before she gets hurt in 2013. She's averaging like 18 and 5 over a 6-year stretch between the ages of 30 and 35. It's truly unprecedented. And we haven't seen anybody like Becky since then either.
She comes back from that injury. She plays more off the ball than she had in the past. The numbers don't necessarily show it. It's how the team was, but again, because the team was really entering those horrendous years, she was moving more off the ball both for athleticism reasons and to let Daniel Robinson really start taking over, because Daniel Robinson was a younger player. Daniel Robinson was more of the future, letting and being able to fit in. In that year, again, after coming back from I think the second ACL injury, she still puts up 8 points on 40, 1,000 shooting. She has 4 assists a game and less than 2 turnovers. It's insane what she did there. And I talked to Dan Hughes somewhat recently. I talked to him about when they swung that trade. And Hunter, I'm excited for you to at least give some more context on the trade specifically. But when they swung that trade, I talked to Dan. I was like, so obviously this is someone who had received a lot of MVP votes, was an all WNBA player in New York. But when you were trading for her, did you see her as someone who you saw as maybe not quite used to her maximum potential in New York? And he didn't really have an answer. He was just this was just this is one of the handful greatest players in the history of the WNBA at that point. The heights that she could reach, even they trade for her at age 30. The heights that she could reach, he thought that there was something beyond necessarily what had happened on paper so far. And any time you had the opportunity to swing for that, he basically said that he could mortgage the entire farm for her and was so confident that he could put in anyone around her and they would still be an excellent team. That this was a player who you could just do that with, even back then, even at that age.
Yeah, very good game, very good trade. They gave up Larkins, I believe. The pick became Larkins in that.
Jessica Davenport, and Erlana Larkins, and they got back a 2nd-round pick that they then flipped with Camille Little for Ann Waters coming in.
Yeah, so 2 players. So the 2 players you mentioned, who were both, one of whom was instrumental, one of whom was just productive for the finals and title Indiana teams, just not with the New York team they were traded to. In summation, great player. Yeah, so my scout with all of us heading a 6th grade, she is an 8. She's the doesn't necessarily win MVP, isn't an MVP candidate every year of her prime. But to me, this is a player who is, for basically her entire career, either number 1 or number 2 at her position. Once you adjust her position, that is an 8. That's the definition of a role 8 player. I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts as to, is this a development thing? Is she just do we actually see more prospects like her than we think, and she's just the hard right tail outcome of development here? I'm wondering sort of how you approach the difference between her actual role as a player and her future value as a prospect.
So I think a lot of that comes down to something that I saw in watching her film, is that she's almost on the same level to me as Tamika Catchings in terms of court awareness, court vision, court mapping, and sort of a basketball IQ sort of thing, which is something that's hard to catch with prospects in the moment. But when you go back and watch, is easier to see in that sort of way when this is an all-time great. You can see the things that they're kind of seeing, oh, she did that because that player rotated here, and that rotation was opening up the backside, and that's where that opening came from. And it's something that is almost impossible to see in the moment. and it's something that she was just doing with regularity at Colorado State. So when you increase the usage on that and you put her in a better situation, it's going to create just monstrous numbers.
Yeah, the biggest thing for me is if she was an average processor at 5'6", she's just not a W player. And I think that's the biggest thing with her film. Like, being 5'6", we've talked about it with other prospects in recent years where we like some of the stuff they do, but none of those players are the processors that is Becky Hammon and what she can do on the ball, off the ball. So for me, in terms of future prospects, I just think there's not many prospects like this to this level. I think the biggest thing is nowadays a player with these numbers would not go undrafted in any scenario. There's so many players that just get drafted because of their stat lines, and they're not even very W level. Like, there's not really any W level skills there. So luckily for that, there's not a player like this is going to slip through the cracks. Like, I don't think that's going to happen nowadays, especially with analytics. And this is a player that would have been an analytics darling if she was coming out of college now. But overall, there's just so much there on the film, and a lot of teams missed out.
To sum that up in terms of career numbers and sort of like a theoretical redraft, if you're what does this player look like if they're not overlooked? So in terms of career wins above replacement, Becky Hammon racks up, I think, a pretty underrated 27 wins above replacement, which if there are issues, I think, in San Antonio with the supporting cast in terms of how this gets divvied up. When you build the entire system around one player, they're probably still going to be a little underrated by those stats. But for reference, that's about the same number as Penny Taylor. That's about the same number as Rebecca Brunson, who has 5 titles. If you did a redraft here and you were being generous to the team's drafting, we watched Shamika Holtzclaw play college ball. Becky Hammon probably goes number 2 overall instead of going undrafted in a 50-player draft.
And not going any lower than 4th.
Yes.
Like, under any circumstances, there's no reason that she should go lower than 4th.
So this is definitely going to be. We'll get into more interesting gaps between where a player went and where they should have gone. But in this case, this is going to be the biggest gap of literally 50 spots.
The biggest gap ever. This is never going to get broken.
No, unless we expand to 30 teams.
Gosh. Here we go.
In 1 year, too.
Yeah, it's Becky and Nikola Jokic and Nikola Jokic.
Isaiah Thomas.
Those are the biggest gaps.
If you made it this point in this episode, you
First
are
of all,
a sicko.
But we could talk about Becky Hammon for another hour.
Legitimately, one of my couple favorite players of all time.
This was longer than every episode last time we did this series, but thinking about thanks for making
those were all incredibly great players, and all you have to say is, yeah, they're good at everything they do, and they got drafted number 1 overall, and they had a great WNBA career.
Yeah, that is true. That is true, and that's why the series is going to be interesting. We might disagree on some prospects.
The more players who play for Dan Hughes, the more interesting.
Thanks for making Locked On Basketball your first listen every day. Join the team at the next week for continued coverage of the WNBA. Make your second listen Locked On Sports Today the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Have a great rest of your weekend, everyone.